So welcome. I will try to extend a little bit the presentation. So yeah, our objective here is to predict the mood. So it's not moving. There. We have twofold in our motivation. The first one is the high incidence in depression that is worldwide. The depression and similar mental health disorders have a really high impact into the people that are suffering them. They affect the all everyday aspect of the everyday life. And so it is important to try to minimize these effects. And one way to minimize them is first trying to prevent the appearance of depression, and second, trying to recognize early their incidence. One way for this, one way to evaluate the mental state of a person is through ecologically momentary assessments, the EMAs, which collect physiological phenomena. Usually they are based on the idea that you ask the person how they are feeling in that specific moment to try to avoid bias later when they are remembering and having maybe corrupted the memories. And of course, when doing this, you are kind of making a pause into your into their daily life. They assess themselves, how is the mood, and then continue. So in trying to avoid this interruption, there is another way to measure these EMAs, and that is through the use of embedded smartphone sensors. So since everyone is so common that everyone is carrying their smartphones around, we can use the sensors that the smartphone has to monitor and measure the activities that the person is getting into on the day. So we can have a log of all what we assume are the important activities of that day. So that's from the way of depression motivation. Then we have a different motivation also that is based on a previous work that also touched on this topic. And they try to predict the mood using different machine learning methods. And from their results, the best machine learning methods for this implementation were support vector regression and random forest. However, they still had an open question, and that was which parameters affect the mood in the participants. They couldn't identify which are the important parameters that were affecting the mood measurements. So we want to take this up and try to answer this question. The objectives that we have is, of course, the mood prediction using Bayesian networks. We want to find the parameters that affect the mood. And we also want to try and compare these results with the previous work results. And for this, we have two research questions that we want to answer. The first one is compare Bayesian networks with support vector regression and random forest. And we want to compare them in terms of efficiency, efficacy, and insight. And we are going to do this in two implementations. The first one is modeling each participant individually. That is, we only use the data from one participant to predict this participant's mood. And in the second questions, we do this, but using a general model. In this case, we use all the available data from all participants, and we model the mood of one participant. So what is the data and the participants that we have here? The data that we work on comes from a pilot study from the BU Amsterdam. And they took 27 students. For 6 weeks, they were asking them to fill a self-assessment mood. And they have to do this five times daily. And additionally to that, the smartphone application where they were logging their mood was also recording different EMAs in the background. So at the end, we had final data set of 24 parameters and 595 data samples. That is for all of the participants together. This, of course, is a result that came after doing some data preprocessing, because we had initially 55 parameters. However, not all of them were presenting enough variance to be able to be fed into a machine learning model. And some of them were just combined to increase their predictive power. So 24 parameters were a little bit too long to present, so they are mostly divided in these 8 groups. They were monitoring the duration and frequency of calls of the 5 most used contacts, the same ones used for the SMS and for the applications. So the application, in this case, the 5 most used applications. They were counting the number of photos that were being taken, the physical activity that the subject was doing each day. They will have a track of their moods from yesterday and the day before yesterday. And they were monitoring the screen of the cell phone. So how long was it being turned on and the frequency of it. Yeah. So the first method that we use and our focus here is the Bayesian networks. Bayesian network is a probabilistic graphical model, and it defines a node, is defined by nodes and arcs. So here nodes are a representation of our variables of interest, in this case, the 24 parameters that we have from the data set. And the arcs are representing the causal dependencies or the conditional dependencies between these parameters. So what we have at the end is a graph that is doing a factorization of the probability of all of these parameters. So in this case, I just can mention the formula we are having for each one of our nodes of interest. We are having the probability of this node having a value, only referring to the parent of this node. And this can be made clearer later when I show some of the results. For building a Bayesian network, there are 2 main steps. The first step is the structured learning. Here we want to learn the graph that is going to define this Bayesian network. And the graph is being defined by the data that we have. In this step, we can include expert knowledge. So in this case, we do not work with that because we didn't have any access to this expert knowledge. But if the case is given, we can have some in the previous information of it. And this can affect the end result of the model. The second step is the parameter learning. Here we want to try to discover which are the parameters that are defining the relationship between each one of the parameters. This again will be a little bit clear later. For this work, since all of the data that we are working on is real, we are using Gaussian Bayesian networks, and we are learning the structure of it using hill climbing search. And we are assuming that the relationship between parameters is going to be linear. Now, for a really short explanation of support vector regression, we have, this is a generalization of support vector machines, which is usually used for classification. And here, what we are working on can be seen as an optimization problem. We want to find the flattest tube that contains all the data points in the different dimensions that we are working on. So for the non-linearities, we use a kernel function. And since we want to compare our results to the previous work, we are going to use the same settings as the previous paper used. So in this case, radial kernel and the hyperparameters are being defined by a system that is included into the implementation of this support vector regression, which we implemented in R. I didn't mention that in the slide. The same goes for random forest. It's going to be implemented in R and is going to follow the same settings from the previous work. Random forest is a really popular nonlinear multiple regression method. And the main idea of it is that you are going to combine a lot of multiple weak learners that are the trees to make a strong learner. So in this case, we are going to use 500 trees to build the forest, and we are going to take 8 variables in each one of the splits. And these splits are going to be done until we cannot measure an improvement or a significant improvement. So for the experiments that we are doing, as mentioned before in the motivation, we are working in 2 implementations. The first one is a single model. So we take only the data for one participant to predict this participant mood. On a general model, we use all the data that we have available, and with all that data, we try to predict one participant's mood. To give a statistical significance to our test, we are going to implement the 10 cross validation runs. That is, we are going to repeat the model for 10 times. In the case of the single model, each participant is going to have their model repeated 10 times. And in the case of the general model, this general model is going to be repeated 10 times. We are going to evaluate this using 3 criteria. The first one is the efficacy. This is going to be measured through the mean square error. The efficiency, we are going to measure through the wall clock time that all of the models, that is including these 10 validation runs, took to be built. And the insight, this is a qualitative measure, and we are going to evaluate it in terms of informativeness and intelligibility. So how much information this model is giving me visually, and how much you can understand it. You can understand from it. So from the results, it could be that the parameter names are a little bit too small, but what we see here are the 24 parameters that we use to build the model. Each node is one of the parameters, and what we see here is first the relationships that each node had with the other. The arrow direction indicates this information direction between the nodes. The thickness of the arrow is representing the confidence that the model has on this relationship. In this case, I highlighted the first 10 strongest relationships just to illustrate it in the plot. And the highlighted gray nodes are showing which one is the Markov blanket of in this case, our target parameter, that is the mood. Here, the Markov blanket is the minimal subset of parameters that you need to have if you want to get to not lose information about one other parameter. If it were necessary, which we didn't implement in this case, if it were necessary to reduce the model, we could keep the Markov blanket and still not be losing information about the mood. However, it was also interesting for us to see how the other parameters interacted with each other. That's in terms of the Bayesian network as a graphical representation. In terms of the other evaluation terms, we see here for the efficacy, the mean square error, that they are quite similar. This is the average across the 10 cross-validation runs. They are quite similar, and as an extra step, we decided to rank the models. And we did that following some multi-comparison tests. And we see that, sorry, all 3 models received the same rank. So the small difference between these mean square errors are not significant. They have the same performance. The stability is showing us if there was some model implementation in the 10 runs that showed outliers, which was not the case. All 3 models were stable. And the time is measured in seconds. And here we can see that Bayesian networks is faster than the other 2 methods. So in this case, there is a gain in speed. The second result comes from the general model. In this case, we use all the data available to create this Bayesian network. And we see the same information here. All the parameters, the Markov blanket parameters that form for the mood nodes. And we see here the same table indicating the other performances. As a first note here, we can see that almost all of the strongest relationship comes from the ID. That combined with how this mean square error, this performance of the 3 different models was not really changing between the models, give us a really good idea that this data may not be good to be used as a general model. It's possible that we have way too few data points for this kind of model. The participants could be having not really different trends, and thus this model was not able to find a really significant relationship between the mood and the other EMAs that we were measuring. So in this case, it was the mood was really being just mostly determined by which participant we were looking at, and the history of the moods of the past days. So this is the mood of one day before and the mood of 2 days before. So we can say that this model was not fitting well. However, we still can see that from the information that the Bayesian network is giving us. As an extra point, we can see here that a Bayesian network is still superior in speed. So only 2 seconds to construct the 10 models has a quite big difference with the other 2 methods. So we can go now to our conclusions. The first question that we had at the beginning was, how will Bayesian networks compare with the other 2 models in the case of the single model? And we can see that first, there is no significant difference in the performance between these 3 models. So in other words, we do not lose any performance, but we see clear advantages in efficiency and insight. So Bayesian network was way faster than the other 2 methods. And it had an important point, that is that we could see the relationships between the parameters. Then for the general model, we can also say that there was no loss in performance. Bayesian network was still presented clear advantages in efficiency and insight. But in this case, we can see that the quality of the data might be insufficient for this type of model. So an important case that you can do with Bayesian networks is that you can try to find causality between the parameters. This is what, in this case, conjectural. We cannot affirm that there is causality between these parameters. For that to be able to be confirmed, we need to conduct experiments that are aimed for that. So this is they will constitute a new experimental take for that, in which more participants will need to come into together for a new study. The data did not include clinical depression data, so it is important to try to repeat this when we have more data. And it will be interesting to include expert knowledge for creating this model. And that's the end of the presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Margarita. Fascinating talk, and actually one that's very close of interest to my own research area. So I'm very keen to discuss some of it later. Are there any questions anybody else has, though, first of all, before we...
Yeah, I do have one.
Thanks, Albert.
So first of all, the presentation was really interesting. And I have a question. Since you noticed from one of your models that the mood of a day might depend on the mood of the previous days, are you considering using a dynamic Bayesian network to try to model the development of the mood over time?
That could be also implemented. We didn't do it here because it was our first approach for this data set, and we wanted to try using the static Bayesian network. But I did consider it. It was just not enough space in this paper.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alberto. One question I have, Margarita. So I think basically your data was from students, wasn't it? Largely. Yes. So I tend to work with patients who might well have clinical depression. So I could imagine that there's going to be a difference. Well, it's very hard to say, but arguably there could be a difference in, for want of a better word, magnitude of change of mood between the type of population you selected, who are of one particular demographic from others. Have you thought about what impact that might have? In fact, is there enough mood change in the people you've got, I think is what I'm trying to say.
There was some mood change. There was not much. So the minimum, so the mood was measured between 1 and 10, 1 being really bad and 10 being the best. And the students were, as a minimum, only taking 6. So the study was had an extra step in which they were filtering out students that were presenting medical depression. So they conducted a test before to filter these students.
Okay, that's interesting. And if I can ask another quick question, that is, so we had a look at some of the features or data that you were taking from the smartphone, and I believe one of those was movement. Can you say a bit more about how you used movement in your model?
Yeah, the accelerometer in the cell phone was measuring for the whole day. So for each hour, it was measuring how much movement it was taking. So if, of course, the student was moving without the cell phone on his pocket, then it was not being recorded. And then this measure of movement, we normalize, or not me, that was from the people who made the data set. They normalize this physical activity to fall into a normal distribution. So that's the kind of information we get from it.
Great. Okay, that's super. Thank you. Any questions from anybody else, please?
Yeah, I have one. Because you know that some of the sources of your data is rather subjective. That is your own opinion about yourself. Can you thought in a way? Did you thought in because I don't know if I have a very bad day. Perhaps I don't bother answering the something I have to do, or I'm not, in a way, I'm not sincere with myself. I said, oh, I'm really fine, but I am not. In a way, how much, and if you said that, in a way, all the subjects that you have are over a certain level, when you in a way use this model for people that perhaps has really problems, how much this kind of subjective human behavior, like I don't want to deal with the problem now, I'm not answering, or I'm not sincere with myself, that in a way will have some consequences of your model also.
Yeah, so that was one problem. First, from this data set, there were a lot of days in which several students or one student did not feel their mood self-assessment. But since this is a model to test this is an experiment to test how this model works, we took those days off. However, the idea with this is that after some days of collecting data, the model is going to be able to predict a level of the mood that you are probably having on that day, based on the other information that is also measuring, because it is also a motivation for having these background measures. Because even if it is having a really good day, maybe you're having so good day that you're forgetting to do other stuff. So we want to, first we have kind of an history, and the model has to know your other behaviors apart from your self-assessment. And then with that, we can start to try to not specifically need this input that you are giving it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, yes, it's good, because in a way, yes, at some point you can avoid this subjective in your model. I think it could be, not better, but perhaps, but in a way more robust, or at least to have this facility, that you are able to, in a way, distinguish these states without really the need of the self-assessment. Thank you.
That's great. Any final questions for Margarita?
Yeah, I had one question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
It's actually on the next slide.
This one.
Yeah, but the idea. I was wondering why you would want to include that. I'm in general, when I do create these machine learning models, I'm a little bit skeptical to including something that identifies the person in question. Because then you're sort of predicting how a person would behave or do, and maybe that's not so interesting when you do machine learning across different people, but maybe you have a specific reason to include it.
Yeah, we had a reason, and it's we did this model without the ID parameter, and it's also mentioned in the paper. The model, as I also said in the presentation, was not really finding any relationship between the parameters. So if we left ID outside, what we were getting was mostly only so the initial probabilities of the parameters, and for the mood we will be having, like you see here, only the past mood as a way of getting information. So the graph will, this is just because it was looking nicer in the presentation, all the graph was looking mostly without any of the arrows that was connecting that are connecting the parameters. That's where we caught up with the problem that this data is not really fitted to model all of the different participants at the same time. So
okay,
just for showing here, we show this this graph, but as I mentioned, this is not a good representation of the model because all the information is taken by the ID.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for the question. Any other final questions for Margarita? Apparently not. So thank you again for your talk. Very interesting. I enjoyed it a lot. So thank you.
Thanks.
That's the last paper in our session. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Thank you to those who asked questions, and in particular, big thanks to the speakers and also to the co-chair Marta for doing a lot in the background and keeping things running. So thank you, Marta, as well. So thank you, everybody. We very much hope to have this workshop running at Evo Apps next year. So please do think about submitting a paper to that at that time. So with that, I'd just like to thank you all again and hope to meet some of you later on. Thank you.